The panel that we're going to have now is aimed at promoting debate on the role of development financial institutions, the IFDSs, in the advancement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. A panel with 60 minutes comprising the team of experts to debate this topic. We'd like to invite Luiz Pereira da Silva, Vice Director General of the Bank for International Settlements, also Alexandre Varela, Head of the Regional Office for Latin America of the European Bank of Investment, Paloma Casero, Director of the World Bank for Brazil, also online, and Adama Mariko, Executive Vice Director of Strategy, Partnerships, Communication of AFD, and Secretary General of Finance in Common, moderated by Sergio Suchodolski. Please come to the stage so that we can start our activities as you take your seats. Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope you are all enjoying our program and high-level debates that the ABDE is promoting today. For me, it is a pleasure to moderate this panel with such renowned guests. And the importance of this panel is increased as we hope to demonstrate how rich this family of development banks and institutions and development financing institutions are, and how diverse they are. So we've seen the 32 members of ABDE participating, and we've seen the credit cooperatives, public banks, SEBRAE, FINEP, and we have some participants who play a key role in their institutions, especially given the characteristics of their operations. Our first speaker is Luiz Pereira da Silva, Awazu Pereira da Silva, who also worked at the bank in Basel and in the area of financing of climate financing and green financing, a person who has been participating in major international debates. So we have Paloma, who represents the World Bank, and perhaps a greatest reference of an institution that emerged at the end of the World War, and perhaps the father of development banks. So we have also our representative from the European Bank of Investment, Alexandre, who is now heading the regional office, reminding you that this is the biggest multilateral bank in the world in terms of disbursements and assets. Lastly, Adama Mariko, who is a personal friend and from the French Development Agency, and he has served in several regional positions in different countries representing the French Development Agency. And Adama is the General Secretary of the Finance in Common Summit. This forum is part of the Finance in Common Summit, so it's a joy to have the participation of the Secretary General. This is one of the major meetings of development banks that take place in the world. And so ABDE participated in the first edition in Paris and also in the second edition in Rome, and the host was FAO together with the Italian Development Bank, CDP. And this year we are going to have a very relevant meeting where the European Investment Bank together with the African Development Bank will be our hosts in a meeting on the Ivory Coast. And so this is a major meeting with over 450 public development banks where they will meet to exchange experiences and establish partnerships to design the future of development. And so I'd like to begin today's discussion giving the floor to Luiz Awazu Pereira da Silva for his views on the main topics of development financing. Hopefully at the end of the pandemic, at a time of relaunching of economies on a new basis, but still a challenging moment, especially for Europe, with the armed conflict in Ukraine and resulting shocks in world economy, starting with energy and fertilizers that we are all experiencing in Brazil and the world. Mr. Awazu, I would like to give you the floor, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you, Sergio. Good afternoon to you all. Good afternoon, Alexandre, Paloma, Adama, and all the participants of the panel. It's an honor to be here with you and to start our discussion on the importance of financial institution and development banks in an agenda of transition towards carbon neutrality. Of course, we are facing a very difficult moment. We had an agenda for the global threats, which require a global response involving multiple players and several instruments that need to complement the effort for transformation of our economies towards carbon neutrality, the regulatory effort, the financial effort, the funding effort that this entails. And of course, we face a tragic situation with the conflict in Europe that, in addition to the urgency of transformation towards carbon neutrality, there are additional issues linked to the conflict itself and the drama experienced by millions of people that deserve our solidarity, but also the fact that this has caused a shock, an energy shock. So this is the context that is of great concern. How to agenda our transformation agenda, our agenda for transformation of our economies and societies towards carbon neutrality amidst all these additional difficulties. Difficulty coordinating in an environment of international dissent, and the difficulty of having to deal with this relative price shock. So I'm going to try to develop a line of reasoning here. We are saying that the important role of development banks in macroeconomy, in the climate macroeconomy. Climate macroeconomy is obviously something that encompasses changes of relative prices through taxation, appropriate taxation of carbon. But this appropriate carbon taxation and the way changes in relative prices can affect our production system, our consumption system, our individual preferences. This takes time and will take time. And obviously we know that in terms of urgency and climate risk, time is limited. First, because given the rate of emission of GHGs, we have 8 to 9 years before we reach a point of non-return with an average temperature increase above 1.5 degrees centigrade in relation to the industrial era. So this is in conflict with could be in conflict with the instrument for taxation of carbon, which will take some time in order to transmit or distribute its effects over the whole of the global economy. So we need to think of additional instruments to help in this process of transformation. And this is where the important role of development banks comes in the way they can contribute through their investments and through a longer-term view of the profitability for the transformation of the capital stock in our economies, and capital stock, a change towards a greener capital stock and less polluting capital stock, and inversion of investments and use of alternative energies that are less carbon intensive, and also the financing of important innovations, ecology research, the need to develop carbon capture that is not only about preserving forests, but also about industrial methods to capture carbon. And this obviously is a very important role of development banks with a longer planning horizon. On their own, are they going to be able to carry out this task? I don't believe so. You must have seen the quantifications of the investment needs for our transformation into a carbon neutral economy. The G7 report, the reports of the McKinsey consultancy, they mentioned trillions of dollars and large share of world GDP, and so obviously public development banks play a role, but this should be done in partnership and a financial mobilization that is taking place also in the private sector. You must have seen after Glasgow the alliance of the private sector that was formed and the goodwill that exists in the way the private sector is itself concerned with the carbon neutrality of their balances and the paths to get their private investments to coincide and converge towards carbon neutrality. And so we need to bet on this partnership and public-private partnership and the capacity to coordinate changes in relative prices.
Even taking advantage of the opportunity due to the current conflict in Europe to accelerate the transformation process and put to a low carbon economy in cooperation with the private sector, the public sector, academia, economists, people in societies get mobilized by this urgency, which is the climate emergency, and at the same time people can get together in conferences like this one in which we can define concrete directions so that each of us in our specific roles like regulators, monetary authorities, Ministry of Economy, in the Treasury, Finance, and the tax regulators, so the public financial system, the private financial system, the banks, everyone can contribute in their own roles to a coordinated plan of transition, which will be sustainable and fair, because this process has redistributive effects, severe and important redistributive effects, and they are important to be considered. They are fundamental, I would say, so that we can all work in the same direction. Thank you, Sergio, and the organizers of this event. Thank you, Luiz. We'll bring you up again in the debates, but thank you for your initial remarks. I would like to give the floor to Alexandre. Alexandre, you work in the European Development Bank, and the headquarters is in Luxembourg, but it is the development bank in Europe. It is the largest multinational bank in the world. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the strategy of the bank in general, the priorities for our region in Latin America, and maybe uh, to address the emergency programs, even including the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, all dear colleagues, fellow panelists, and dear audience. Beta has launched, Sergio, in the beginning of the year, a strategy of getting closer to partners from outside of European Union. We have created an institution within the group which is called Epiclobo. The objective with the creation of this agency is especially to mobilize, and alongside with the European Commission and other bilateral committees in Europe, like FW, in the spirit that we are calling Team Europe. So in the spirit of the Team Europe, we are mobilizing resources that the European Union and its several partners have and agents have to sponsor and promote sustainable development in the region, not only in Latin America, but also in Africa, in the Caribbean region, in Asia, and in the Pacific region. Within this strategy, we have to bring together the teams of the bank. As you mentioned, they are in Luxembourg, but bring them closer to local needs. So there will be a redesign and redistribution of teams, especially in terms of regional hubs for all of the regions that I've mentioned. And this will bring the bank closer to its customers so that the bank can understand its customers and better cooperate with our stakeholders in the regions. The priority of the bank will continue to have its priority in the climate action. So in European Union, this is considered the common asset we should all be working on. As Luiz said, this will contribute so that projects that promote this energy transition can be implemented in an accelerated pace, because we are getting closer and closer to the limit of 1.5 degree Celsius, because we don't want that, because we cannot fathom the consequences ahead. So there are projects that promote energy efficiency and renewable energy. These will be projects that will be in the bank's strategy. We continue with water sanitation projects here in Brazil and other countries of Latin America. We have been funded water projects as well. One other part that the bank has a lot of expertise in is urban transportation. We have funded subway systems in all Latin America capitals, or urban trains. This is one line of financing that should remain, and also multilateral financing with regional development banks that utilize our bank's resources to take them to medium and small sized enterprises that work with the climate somehow. And one other part, and we've had a very interesting operation 2 years ago when the pandemic started, was an operation with the Bank of the Northeast in Brazil, which has a project which is gender focused. A very important project that helped provide liquidity to small and medium-sized enterprises, micro and small enterprises. And many of the companies were struck by the pandemic restrictions, and the bank supported their operations. So from our perspective, this is the main contribution of the European Union, that we can offer to the region. So, as I said, in cooperation with the European Commission and with the European development institutions. This will be the strategy for the bank in the next 7 years. Thank you, Alexandre. Very interesting to note that the European Investment Bank is a bank whose members are the European Union countries. Brazil is not an associate country, but we act in the region. So neighboring countries have mandates of partnerships, which is very important. I'd like to give the floor to Paloma Casero. She's the director of the World Bank to Brazil. She represents the World Bank Group in Brazil. Paloma, it's always important to revisit the name of the World Bank. The Bank for Reconstruction and Development is a very symbolic name, and it refers back to the origins of the bank in the Bretton Woods agreements at the end of the Second World War to create a new financial and economic system. The IMF is one of the other pillars created at the time. GATT, the International Organization of Trade, and then the World Trade Organization in the more recent decades. I'm mentioning all of that because the World Bank was created in a moment in which the world was destroyed by World War II. And if I'm not mistaken, the first operation of the World Bank was to France, was dedicated to France. France was destroyed in World War II, and it was the first credit operation for the reconstruction of a destroyed Europe. We live in a world of major climate emergencies, sustainable development challenges, and we are getting closer to the 2030 agenda, and there's also this conflict right now. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the activities of the World Bank in Brazil, but also the global agenda, given the challenges we currently face. Thank you, and you have the floor, Paloma. Thank you, Sergio. It is my honor to be here with you. And greetings to Alexandre, Adama, and Luiz. And thank you also to the presidency of the ABDE and the organizers. I'd like to start with the last point you mentioned about the risks and the relevance of the World Bank Group in Brazil currently. Given the Forum of Development and the ABDE report, I would like to emphasize the climatic risks and the impact not only over our economies but also on the most vulnerable populations. I'll start with the climatic risks that are aggravated by the complicated external situation in the macroeconomic level, but also, as you commented, in terms of the conflict, in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, that are impacting the whole world. In terms of climatic risks, we are concerned, as Luiz explained, with several dimensions, because we can see that there is a discussion that's not specific to Brazil. It's happening all over the world, and the World Bank Group is committed to working with the partner countries in trying to mitigate those risks. And in the specific case of Brazil, we are concerned with the deforestation in the Amazon region. And first, there's a local impact. It really overloads the system in a forest area, which is one of the largest in the world, but it's also sensitive at a global level and regional levels as well. And the last studies point out to a reduction of the green area of the Amazon. That indicates that we should be very concerned with expanding actions to support reforestation, natural forests, but also to control deforestation. In addition to that, it's not just an environment problem, it actually affects the life conditions in the Amazon region. and it has an impact on biodiversity and agriculture. Another risk we're very much concerned with has to do with the natural disasters, which affect the whole world, including Brazil. And there's a number of risks. We have seeing an increased frequency of natural disasters, and these events have to do with very strong rains in many parts of the country, and the worst dry spells in the last 20 years. It really has affected the prices. And about the current conflict, this is another point of pressure on the price of food, and at the end this is translated in an impact on inflation and consumption products for populations, and the most vulnerable populations will suffer more. And in this sense, we have some challenges. Well, Brazil has a lot of opportunities to resume or to recover in a more resilient and green manner. So there are key sectors in the economy that can help us recover from the very harsh pandemic. So from the perspective of the role of financial institutions in the world and the World Bank, we consider important to look at this role of the World Bank in several different ways. First, we have a direct partnership with key sectors that can help green growth. The examples are similar to what Alexandre mentioned. For us, it's also very important to support the agricultural sector and the transition of the agricultural sector, especially in terms of low carbon. And we also have many projects that are guided to the strengthening of urban mobility, less dependency on traditional methods of transportation, which are very carbon intensive. And we also have key projects in the sectors of water and sanitation and everything that has to do with the infrastructure of the cities. First, this is very important because it accounts for many different disasters, and it has a lot to do with populational density. We can see also a lot of opportunities in green financing, and the financial sector in Brazil has a key role, and the bank has been a pioneer in this area. There's so many opportunities in the financial market to really support this climate transition, and opportunities such as opening carbon markets. So we can either have direct funding with projects and impact, and the second role is in that financial institutions have is to mobilize private capital, because in the case of Brazil, one additional challenge to climatic risks are fiscal or tax challenges. The pandemic was very harsh, so the fiscal situation is very delicate, and the federal governments and many of the subnational governments don't have enough tax space to deal with the growth that is needed for this climatic agenda of development.
And so part of the World Bank group, and also we are a group with financial and friendly cooperation. We can help mobilize this private capital for these important sectors and also leverage long-term financing. Many of the climate financing areas entail several challenges. One of them is insufficient long-term financing for investments in this area. Another important work that we are going to conduct in partnership with other multilateral, bilateral partners and the government of Brazil is to catalyze actions and confer credibility and transparency to criteria that investors need, for instance, in the area of green investment. We think that there are opportunities, but many of them lack harmonization of criteria in order to distinguish the carbon credit qualities and those that are really green, and many efforts require credibility of the taxonomy, green taxonomy criteria. But fundamentally, the changes in business models of many companies, and so supporting, mobilizing, and coordinating so many sectors that are going to improve credibility and transparency, because ultimately we know that there's huge potential. I'd like to end by mentioning all the potential of the energy sector, renewable energies, and Brazil in some areas of the north is leading, together with Chile, and the development of the hydrogen potential, and also potential in area of renewable energies, both solar and wind energies. This is important because, well, I want to conclude by saying that there are many risks. It's important to have this coordination, as Luiz said, the coordination of partnership, PPPs, and also involving international and domestic partners, and keeping in mind that there is potential. So this is very much related to coordination, a focus that is not only macro but also micro, because ultimately, yes, local populations, if local populations don't see a benefit, it will be difficult to sustain efforts. And so thank you, and I'd like to give the floor back to you. Thank you, Paloma. We will revisit some of the points you brought up. Before I give the floor to Adama Mariko, just to provide some more context, Adama is a career officer of the French Development Agency led by Hemiu. Hemiu is also president of the International Development Finance Club. It's a club that gathers the main development banks, national development banks of the world, and even some regional and multilateral development banks such as CAF, which was founded 10 years ago by the then president of BNDES, Luciano Coutinho, and president of the CAF at the time, and of KfW. And so this group evolved. There are elections, and in the scope of the presidency of the French Development Agency, they created the Finance in Common Summit, which is a milestone in the calendar of development finance institutions. And so within the ABDA has been participating in the editions, and also with a section dedicated to subnational development banks. I had the opportunity to lead one of the high-level panels in 2020, 2021. I hope we will be present also in 2022, and also the Alliance of Subnational Development Banks of Latin America and Caribbean, gathering more than 200 professionals in the area, from the area, and also about sharing solutions, programs, successful programs in the financing of development of cities, micro, small companies, infrastructure projects, and the whole 2030 agenda. So with this context, I'd like to give the floor to Adama Mariko, who has come directly from Paris to join us. You have the floor.
I'm sorry, I'm going to do it in English. Next time, maybe I will try a bit more of Portuguese. I'm really, really glad to be here, and thank you for that perspective you have given us. Finance in Common is the new kid in the block, I would say. It was founded 2 or 3 years ago but it was founded by public development banks. Public development banks are here since longer ago. We have, you have mentioned the fact that World Bank funded France after the war, and the war was 70 years ago. French Development Agency just celebrated the 80 years anniversary, and of course, public development banks has been here since a while to finance the public policies and to help states to build better for their citizens. So, what is finance in common? Finance in common is a bold idea, I would say. It was the fact that public development banks has looked at themselves and say we should join forces and commit ourselves to solve one big problem, which is how we align ourselves and our activities, all our investments toward SDGs and Paris alignment and the 2030 agenda. This might seem utopic, but of course the crisis and the COVID showed to everybody that it was about time that public development banks join their forces. Whether they are big, small, that is not the problem. And of course, if you look at my that thing I have on my suit, you see different colors, different size. All of them mean that public development banks can be in different regions, can be $1 billion or $1 million company, but they all move in the same direction. No matter their size. It is really the fact that we have to face challenges and to bring solutions for our governments. So how do we do it? Public development banks, as I said, we not just do summits for summits. We have to put some work and show what we do. It's not just to have advocacy and to make influence. Of course, it's important to give access to the small banks and the national development banks to the international fora and the international discussion. That was the first step we had brought. Finance in Common is like 530 banks around the world. This is quite huge. And of course, there are different modalities with those banks. You have some of them are just focused on working on their own ground countries, and you have some of them which have international activities. But if you look at some numbers, 90% of those financial institutions I've mentioned work in their national ground, 90%. And only 10% have international broad activity. So this is really important that we have key numbers in mind, because while we speak about development, some of us work in those international organizations, we usually think of north-south relation. It's not just that. It's, first of all, development banks created by the states in their own country for their own development. And that is the main point I wanted to mention here. And having banks collaborating among themselves give the opportunity sometime to some banks in Africa or Asia. They have not access to the international fora by themselves, but through Finance in Common, they had the access to go to the COP and speak out their problems. And they have access to go to the G20 or UN, in the UN agency to speak out their problem through Finance in Common. So, what was the commitment on Finance in Common? The first year, we have organized the first summit in Paris. At the time, we found we was 450 banks. This number is not just something we have created. It is based on research, and I will tell you about that later. But by the time we have signed a joint declaration, which was signed by all the regional networks, including ALIDE from South America, and regional networks from Africa, Europe, Asia, and also several multilateral development banks. I've signed those declaration. We have in the joint declaration 50 commitments which has been taken by public development banks, and my job is daily basis to see how we implement this and how we report on that matter. The second year and the second edition has taken place in Rome, and there we have demonstrated actually that we could have a strong voice because, and thanks to the Italian G20 presidency, the finance in common has been recognized as some movement by public development banks for SDGs and for the Paris Agreement, that was a big achievement actually to have this G20 recognition. But not just that, finance in common is also a key milestone in the international debate, because at the COP26, and some of our panelists have mentioned it, it was really something obvious that public development banks and multilateral development banks have been mostly called to act more and to gather and to bring private finance, etc. But this message is not just for multilateral development banks, it's for all the public development banks, including those who work in their own countries. So it is important. At this point, we keep that in mind. I'm not going back to say what everybody have said. The time is critical. We have some social challenges. We have some security challenges linked sometimes with those social challenges. And we have these climate challenges. So the fact that the Public Development Bank can go to those international forums, influence on the policymakers, is not for themselves. It's actually to think themselves as part of the solution, how we can use that international money flows to concentrate it through the balance sheet we have and to leverage private finance and to bring solution at the proximity we have with customers for our projects. A few numbers. Those 530 banks represent more than 20 trillion of balance sheet. This is huge. And every year, they bring 2.5 trillion of new investment in the world. So, if we see those numbers, we're like, why there is still poverty? Of course, this number can seem huge, but it's not that big, because it's just between 12 to 15% of the international investment around the world. The rest of it comes from private sector and the state budgets. But what we have noticed is that during the COVID, the fiscal surface of states have been narrowed, and public development banks have stepped up to bring financement, and they pushed their capacity at more than 20% to bring solution and to bring quick responses and as the countercyclical role for their governments. That shows that we can do it. So let's not stop there. We have solutions, and time by time we are also discussing with our own states, including that. I just want to congratulate ABDE and the Brazilian public development banks. The fact that you have, put on the table a program and to show to political candidates that you can be part of the solution is the matter. Now we're talking about this, because if you look at the governance of those public development banks, it's states. So we are here to bring solution for our governments, whether we are national development banks, sub-regional development banks, or international development banks. So those solutions, it's really important that we focus on what matters to people. Just to finish, when I speak about those big numbers, let's not fool ourselves. We are First of all, each of us, while we are public development banks, we work on the ground. We have bits on the ground. This financing in common is not just to make summits. It's first of all to find solutions and to share knowledge among public development banks. Because, as I said, we are all different. But having a research pillar within finance in common, it is a way to bring the masterminds of research within the academia, within the economists, within the public development banks, to think about new solutions and share it among public development banks. That is a quite huge challenge, and within 2 years we have published 15 research papers so far. And also there is the last mile, which has to be something really important, and that is where the regional networks has their part of the burden by also transforming their own ecosystem locally. And that's what I've seen so far with ABDE. And I'm really glad to see that you have think about capacity building processes and have public development banks among themselves share also that burden of capacity building. That's why I'm glad to see that AFD, for example, have bring financement to ABDE to help of those capacity building. And I'm sure all our colleagues here also from European institutions think about those processes. So we have also to share that burden of building a local a strong ecosystem of public development banks that can take into account what really matters to people. I have a lot of things to say, but maybe we will share it later on. Thank you.
Obrigado, Adama.
Thank you, Adama. We will now move to the part of the debates, but it's important to highlight one point that Adama made. First, giving voice to development institutions, financial institutions of many countries and regions, and this is the exercise we are doing today and tomorrow with the presence of the 32 members of ABDE and the national presence of different agencies we have from the northern region, Roraima, Amapá, and development agencies, credit cooperatives and public banks all over Brazil, and BDE gives a voice but also brings the lessons learned to the ground level. Microcredit, SMEs, big companies, big infrastructure projects, small infrastructure projects as well, funding in innovation, funding to cities and municipalities in a very innovative manner. So indeed, Adama, as you said very well, these institutions are not only for credit and projects, but these are knowledge building institutions. Knowledge and capacity building is what we look for. With the joint effort of the members, we try to consolidate in our proposals, in our diagnostic and our missions. Our ABDE 2030 plan has over 40 pages of knowledge. So I'd like to go back with Luiz Azu. The Basileia Bank and the central banks with many different stakeholders. I have followed your activities for quite some time, and even in the foray related to changes in the regulation, we've seen recently in Brazil the advances of the agenda of governance, social environmental governance, green funding, open banking, bringing this topic of transparency and competitiveness, the advances of fintechs, payment methods. I'd like you to tell us a little bit how this agenda goes through the Basileia Bank and how is the discussion with the main policymakers and regulators is going on right now, and how that distills into the small development agencies that are also regulated by central banks. At least it is in Brazil. I'll give you the floor, Luiz. Thank you, Sergio. The regulation in the financial sector has a very important role to improve the instruments of credit risk assessment and also to strengthen financing. The two things go together. With the new technologies, with the digital ID document, with the digitization of common platforms, it will be much easier to grant credit in a more specific manner, in a more dedicated manner, while assessing better the content, the green content of the financial instruments, improving taxonomy, making the investors much clearer about what they are investing on. So this is one of the activities we have been promoting with the creation of our innovation fund. So we have several projects that will develop new technologies in the Basel Committee, and which will strengthen microcredit and the improvement of risk assessment, as well as green funding and green financing. We have also some work for central banks that aim to invest in greener instruments, if you will, products to fulfill their needs. But let me just go back quickly to one of the topics you have mentioned in the beginning, which is the effect of the European conflict on what we all do. It's very sad to talk about the term war. In any circumstance, it's always a tragedy. But we need to have a consensus that this might lead to two types of scenarios, extreme scenarios. One of the extreme scenarios, some of you have touched upon the consequences of that in terms of inflation, food prices, volatility, instability, and high prices of oil, the fossil fuels. And it may be the case that each country will protect itself better, so a protectionism because of the energy conflict. The conflict in Europe made energy become matter of social security, and this can develop in such a way in that this protectionism, this format of solving problems in an emergency manner, might lead to decisions in which you place as a secondary objective the fight against climate change and global warming. These could become secondary concerns, and it's an understandable scenario. We need to understand how the national security agenda will get mixed up with the energy independence agenda and the sustainability agenda and climate change agenda will have to be fit into this system. And there can be another scenario, because there is an awareness to the fact that we cannot depend on fossil fuels, whatever they are. We should start to develop, and we should accelerate a plan to reach carbon neutrality. Europe has begun that, and many countries have claimed that need as well, and many countries have committed with this agenda of carbon neutrality. So maybe this brutal situation of energy emergency in Europe can serve as a warning, so that we can associate that need to the acceleration of the transition of our society's productive systems to depend less and less on fossil fuels. Not only because we know that they are directly or indirectly reason for conflict, but also because we know well, the last report of the IPCC, several academics, we know that this dependence on, in general terms, is something that leads us to lose another war, which is a war against climate change and global warming, which is being lost today. Our emission levels of greenhouse effect gases are not being reduced, they are increasing actually. This is a crucial matter for us to reflect upon how we should work to solve the very serious conflicts that are going on in the world, but also that we should put together an agenda that is being developed, well, among all of us, but especially by you, development banks, which is the transformation of our societies to a productive system for carbon neutrality. And at the same time, we should have environmental sustainability and social justice. This is what I had to say. Thank you. Thank you, Luiz. Well, talking about emergencies, Alexandre, the European Investment Bank, well, you gave us a general overview of the strategy and priorities in our region. So you touched upon some of the aspects mentioned by Luiz as well in Glasgow, in the pavilion of investment. We were at the site of the hub of civil society, where I had the opportunity to attend to some of the activities. So Alexandre, I'd like you to talk about two emerging topics which are quite relevant as examples, which is the activity of the development of the vaccine for COVID-19 and the crisis in Ukraine. It is true, the bank, in addition to, well, despite our activities are focused on climate, in 2012 we decided to become the climate bank in European Union. So half the funding we offer to all regions in Europe are dedicated to climate topics, and this represents 60 billion euros a year. When the pandemic came up, the bank understood the emergency and started to cooperate with vaccine manufacturers from several companies that were investing in this investigation, and some companies have achieved good results. Pfizer Biotech is one of the companies that managed to participate, and it's also important to see that in terms of the engagement of the bank in the production of vaccines didn't stop there. We have a very strong activity in decentralizing the production of vaccines, because we realized, of course, this was something that caught us all by surprise, but there was a mismatch or an unbalanced situation in terms of where the vaccines were being produced, and terrible delays of distribution to certain areas of the planet. So we are now engaged in creating satellites, regional satellites of production that can provide service to several countries. I participated in a seminar 2 weeks ago organized by the Mexican government, and so OFC, the World Bank was there. Paloma is here as well. So they share this perspective, is that it's not possible, it's not acceptable that each country should have a lab to produce vaccines to their countries, because that generates deficiency. But when we have satellites that can provide for a micro region, a group of countries is already a solution that can meet the need to distribute vaccines in a faster and more equitable manner among all countries. So the Ukraine conflict, Luiz commented on that, and we are all very sad to see this aggression. This is something that in Europe it was expected for it to be left in the past, but in the 21st century we already we have yet another conflict.
So the energy part for the European Union, the energy issue and dependence on Russian gas, is something that led all member states to a meeting in Paris to rediscuss how to make a transition to decrease this dependence. So this is already underway with discussion groups seeking solutions to reduce dependence. And the European Investment Bank, which was created also after the Second War with the idea of unifying Europe and providing interconnection of sectors such as energy, transport, and telecommunications. So the bank will certainly participate in this energy transition that we all hope will be a clean transition with no emissions. Europe is committed to becoming a neutral continent in upcoming years, and so let us all hope that this violence will end as soon as possible and peace be reestablished. Thank you, Alexandre. These are very relevant topics and of concern for all of us. Of course, we are concerned with the world in general, situation of the world in general, and these emergencies. I'd like to give the floor very quickly towards the end of our session. I'd like to give the floor first to Paloma. Paloma, can you provide the view of the World Bank from now on? We see the wealth and diversity of financial institutions in each of the stages, from subnational to national to regional. And so you as a global bank, at a time when there's the entry of new players and recent creation of two multilateral development banks, the New Development Bank and the BRICS Bank in Shanghai, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the OAID. So these are two members of the family of major multilateral banks. And they coordinate, and the group this year, if I'm not mistaken, is chaired by the European Investment Bank. Last year it was the Islamic Development Bank, and so the coordination of financing policies at a global level. And so you, as the big brother, the older brother, what kind of collaboration can we expect? First, it's important to have this diversity of partners and public banks. Adama mentioned the regional, local, national levels and multilateral level. And so it's important. Well, it's a landscape, a financial landscape that is very diversified, and that's good. Each bank will clearly have their priorities, but if we look at the messages from all the banks mentioned, the MDP, we have CAF, we have the IDB, we have several regional banks also cooperating in the region and in Brazil. So I believe there is alignment of priorities. This development that needs to be inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. And so I believe that the banks have been, or need to make an effort to coordinate, for example, together with other entities, the criteria, the importance, for instance, in the area of climate financing, the importance of harmonizing green taxonomies, for instance. And so these banks, there are several forums, and it's important to achieve international alignment about these criteria in order to help mobilize private capital. I also believe that there are many examples. In the case of Brazil, we've seen close collaboration in the COVID response. In the COVID response, all the banks present here coordinated. NDB, IDB, CAF, World Bank, FD, they coordinated, and it was a beautiful example that in partnership with the government of Brazil, that this quick, agile coordination is important in responding to the crisis posed by the pandemic. Secondly, we had several areas where private capital was needed in infrastructure financing, and we have several examples of coordination with parallel financing. We have projects with the French Development Agency, the financial side of the agency, and these are important steps. The challenges, the investment challenges, are huge, and we need more investment. As I said, there's the fiscal challenge. This fiscal space is not yet the coordination of the banks is very important in this area, and also important to support long-term financing. Another important topic. So we see a lot of short-term investment financing, but also equity financing, which is another aspect that needs support. Thank you. Thank you, Paloma. I'd like to give the floor now to Adama Mariko for a conclusion on his first trip to Brazil. I hope it is the first of many. Adama, the floor is yours.
It was actually a dream to come in Brazil, so it's now fulfilled, and for sure I'll come back again. Yeah, you said it. There is an emergency, but I think that we are not at the fatality point, because public development banks have already shown also the capacity to bring quick responses in an emergency time. So I think that there is some step we have acquired. We have set the bar high, our public development banks, and we should continue and not lose what we have succeeded to do. If I take the Brazilian example, and it has been also mentioned by Paloma, the fact that you have all those public development banks coming together, collaborate to bring one quick response is something quite exemplary, and I think that this should be the new normal, actually. Rémi Rioux, as the president of IDFC and Finance in Common, used to take this example by saying that countries, they have their global strategy, so they do geopolitics, they compete, and sometimes, sadly, we see it right now in a bad manner. But also we know that private sector, as they have brands and private, I see private opportunities, so they may also be competing, and this is also the normal way to do business. But public development banks should not compete, and what we do is we collaborate. So let's just keep that momentum, and the urgency is, as high as we don't have any choice but to keep collaborating. That's what we do in Finance in Common, and that's where also we think that we have quite a beautiful time to come, but the challenges won't be less important. So the fact that we have to mobilize private sector of course, each one of us as public development banks has to do it in his own ground, in his own constituency. But at the international level, the fact that we have the creation of the G-Funds, Global Financial Alliance Network for Net Zero, it is important that public development banks join forces with G-Funds to keep building back better through this new time of after COVID. There is urgencies. I think the most important one is to invest in social matters. Social investment is not a cost, and we have to say it, because sometimes we think that by bringing subsidies or making long-term loans with low rates in social matters, it can be, sometimes the second choice, but no, we have to make it the first choice. But because investing in social matters, it's not a cost. Actually, it's an opportunity for the long term, and that's where the banks are working on health, on education systems. So maybe two last point. The human rights and the CSOs, the civil society, it's really important at the time we are at, and all the social challenges we have, the gap we have between capital and the daily basis impact of the security matters, of climate matters, mean that we have to keep in our project, keep an eye on the human rights matters to pass it, to give more peace in the space while we bring financial flows into the economics. So there will be finance in common in 2022. This will be in Abidjan, and it's the first time that we go out of Europe. The first edition was in Paris. Last year it was in Rome. This time it is organized, and thank you very much to our colleagues from European Investment Bank and the African Development Banks. Two major multilateral development banks took the floor and will organize the next summit, and the thematics is quite actual. We will talk about green growth, recovery, social investment. We will also talk about several thematics which will be really interesting for Brazil to come to showcase what you have achieved on that matter. I mean by that the fact that we will talk about funding cities and how to build coherent urban development, and also how to have blue economy. So it's really important that you come as ABDE and its members to showcase what you have achieved here in Brazil and the exemplarity of the work you have doing here. And I'm really thankful to Alide and Brazil, ABDE, for your involvement in the financing common process. So let's keep it up, because 20% of the public development banks on the world are actually in Latin America. 20% is quite huge, and it shows that there is a place also to demonstrate those things. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Adama, Luiz, Paloma, Alexandre.
Thank you. Thank you to all the members of the second panel, and I conclude hoping that the Development Forum will be part of the events that in this what should become an international, will be part of the international circuit, and we hope to welcome an edition of Finance in Common in Brazil, who knows, in the upcoming years.